Hey there, welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a toddler whisperer, a speech therapist, and a parent coach. And today, Emily Roper is back with us. Emily, welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about birth and stuff that happens. But before we do that, just reintroduce yourself for the folks who may not have heard your first episode and pause. If you haven't listened to Emily's first episode, go back and listen to that. We'll link to it in the show notes. So, Emily, go ahead.
Awesome. Well, I am a neurodevelopmental delay therapist and a certified midwives assistant. I have been doing both things for over a decade. I own a private therapy practice called Early Roots, where I work with kids who have developmental delays, look for that are developing during early stages of life. So things like our stress response, I look at things like primitive reflexes and visual development and vestibular development and the sensory systems and all of these pieces that are really important for later brain health, for things like emotion regulation and for school and for connection and all kinds of things. And then I also work at a home birth practice, helping moms during labor, and then I provide postpartum care for families too. And I've been doing both for a really long time, and I know that they sound completely unconnected in what they are, and the jobs themselves look very different, but they're actually very, very connected. So the types of things that I'm seeing in older kids are often can be traced back to things that happen prenatally, things that happen during our birth, which is a big deal that most people don't talk about, and then things that happen postpartum and during the first year.
Okay, before we go any further, it feels very important to say, and I'm sure you'll join me, that the purpose of this podcast is not to have people go back in their own histories and say, I should have done that. I should not have done the other. I'm a terrible person. Can you elaborate, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, there's no mom guilt. We have way too much of that anyway. This is mostly so people can understand what happens during these early stages, understand how the brain works, when things can kind of get disrupted, and how we can support kids after. Because sometimes we have control over some of these things, and sometimes we don't, especially when it comes to birth. A lot of times, babies and our situation decides what happens with our birth. That's not always something we have control over. So
Yeah.
no guilt allowed.
Yeah, good. Okay, so awareness, not judgment, always. And also connecting the dots. I mean, you kind of did it very, very quickly, which is what I asked you to do in the intro. But it's true that the nervous system we come in with is the nervous system that responds to the environment in ways that are either helpful or not so helpful, is the nervous system that we're then dealing with when we see kids who are having, in air quotes, difficult behavior. So, right, this notion that dysregulation comes from nowhere is false. So that's why I love to have these conversations with you. And so let's just pull that thread, pull it back here, and take a look.
Yeah, so I think what's really important for people to understand is that our brain is constantly learning how to function, and it learns, like, our brain develops based on how we experience or what we experience. So in pregnancy, for example, everything that mom's nervous system is experiencing, baby's nervous system is experiencing, and that is teaching their body and brain how to function once they're on their own and they're no longer in the womb and they have to start doing these things on their own. So everything that we experience prenatally and then beyond is shaping the way that our brains and bodies learn how to function. And so those experiences are really, really important. And we know this, in the development psychology world, we know this a lot about pregnancy. Everybody understands that, like, stress in pregnancy affects nervous systems, and there's tons of research and data on how mom's mental health impacts baby's mental health and so on. And that's all very, very important. But that birth piece is missed a lot. A lot of times we just skip right over birth and jump into infancy, because birth is such a relatively short period of time in our lives. And I think most people don't realize that the whole purpose of birth is not just get baby on the outside, that there's a lot of things that are happening during labor, during the birth process, that are setting up our brains and bodies to function outside the womb when we're on our own. And that how that happens can shape how our brains and bodies function beyond that, and can either create this nice, wonderful, positive experience where we start to develop a lot of other skills, or we can have kind of this the negative domino effect where it starts this cascade of problems with the way that our brains and bodies function. And it can all be, a lot of it can be traced back to this one moment in time.
So, okay, let's talk about birth for a second, because you're right, it's like birth is the way we get the baby out, and it's hopefully a shortish period of time, and if it lasts too long, then measures are taken. And if you really sit and think about it, it's pretty traumatic, even if it goes very, very well. So I want you to maybe describe sort of a best case scenario, and then maybe we'll pull on kind of all of the ways in which, a best case scenario gets modified. With an eye toward, again, part of the reason this podcast is called the Complicated Kids Podcast is because, right, it's really, child development is really complicated, but we don't notice that it's complicated until something's not going the way we expect it to. So in the same way, let's outline this, like, I don't know, in air quotes, perfect birth. What is it designed to do? What's happening? What are we looking for here?
Yeah, of course. So there's several things that are happening from baby's perspective during labor and birth. And so during labor, one of the things that's happening is mom's experiencing a lot of contractions. So, and her uterus is contracting, it's squeezing on baby, and it is helping to prep them for actual delivery. And one of the things that happens to babies during that time is we see this rise in their cortisol levels. During pregnancy, babies have relatively low cortisol levels. They rise significantly during labor. And I know most of us hear cortisol and think that that is a bad thing, but cortisol is actually really, really important for a lot of different functions. And one of the things that it does is helps babies with all of the different physical and physiological transitions that they need to make once they're on the outside. So once they're born, they have to start breathing on their own. They have to start digesting on their own. They have to do a lot of different complex things. And it is arguably one of the most complicated transitions that we ever make. There's not really anything else in the human experience that kind of rivals that transition from becoming a fetus to being a newborn. And we just don't really think of it being this highly complex thing because most of the time little babies just do it well on their own. But one of the things that's helping with that is raising their cortisol levels. And a labor where mom experiences a lot of contractions and they get progressively longer and stronger and closer together, that helps to optimize baby's physiology. Cortisol is one of the things, but there's a lot of different physiological things that are happening. And then babies, when you're actually pushing and they're being born, have to make a lot of different movements and rotations to assist with that process. So they're actually active participants in the birth process. And they use a lot of different reflexes and early movement patterns in order to do that. So they aren't consciously knowing I need to move my head in this position or anything like that. This is all happening, at the brainstem subconscious reflex level of things. And the process of going through a normal vaginal birth, where they're not being, delivered by cesarean, there's no forceps or vacuum or something that's taking that active control away from them. That process helps to optimize all of these early reflexes that they use so that when they're born, all these early reflexes work well for them. And their body and brain know that they're on the outside and they have to start doing a lot more. And they're in charge now of a lot more of their own movements. So that is one of the ways that that happens. So when I talk about a normal birth, I don't just mean a vaginal birth. But I do mean that. But I also mean a birth that is not induced, where there's no extra medications, where there's no additional interventions that kind of remove, it's basically just mom goes into labor naturally, no additional medications or interventions, baby comes out of the vagina.
Yeah.
So that would be like typical normal, quote unquote, birth.
I had no idea that was such an active process. I am learning so much right now. Continue.
No, that's it. So that's what we look at with kind of a normal birth. And then from my perspective, when I'm looking at older kids who maybe still have their nervous system and their stress response has not developed properly. And I'm looking back at birth specifically. There's a lot of reasons why that can happen. Birth is kind of one of the things that can intervene. The risk factors are going to be things like any sort of birth trauma. So a baby that had like major dips in their heart tones, that lost a lot of oxygen, that came out not breathing and not able to transition on their own. Anytime we intervene in a big way with things like forceps or vacuum, that puts a lot of pressure on babies' heads. It also interferes with the way that their head and neck move and develop after birth. So that can really disrupt a lot of those early movement patterns. It usually can create like a significant amount of trauma on the head. Those types of things, cesarean, those would be kind of the risky and when I say risky, I mean at risk for the types of developmental delays that I look at later. Obviously, sometimes those things are very important and necessary, and we're very grateful for cesareans when we need them. But it does place your baby at a slightly higher risk of having some of these problems later on.
Mhm. Okay, so talk a little bit about C-section. Um, and again, without the judgment piece, which I know you're not going to bring, but as the listener is listening, let's just kind of take the either the self-judgment or the judgment of others or the judgment of your doctor. Let's just take that out because it's very interesting what can happen. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. So C-sections are a risk factor for a couple of things. So the first thing that I consider, like when I'm looking at somebody's history, is why the C-section was done in the first place, whether it was something that was scheduled and mom never went into labor. So we have the question of whether or not this baby was actually ready to come on the outside or whether physiologically they're a little bit underdeveloped. That can impact the way their nervous system functions. I want to know, was mom laboring and there were complications and she needed a C-section because baby was not okay? That brings a different set of complications. And also, too, like I mentioned before, there's a process of labor that's good for babies' brain and body development. Them actually experiencing contractions is helping them to make that transition. When they just go from being in the womb to boom, all of a sudden we did a planned C-section and they're out, they don't get any of that transition. And that affects the way that their startle reflex works after birth. It affects the way they process sensory information. It affects things like your gut and your immune health afterwards. There's a lot of different things that are going on. And so, again, it's like you mentioned, the complicated kids. Birth is complicated too. So there's a lot of little things that we're looking at that can add up and play a role eventually.
mhm.
But the other thing is we're bypassing babies' participation, so they don't use their reflexes in the same way, and they don't get the same input. They're not squeezed by mom the same way they are when they're born vaginally, and that squeezing helps to prime their nervous system. It helps to prime their stress response actually in a really positive way. It helps to squeeze, kind of manually squeeze all of the fluid out of their lungs so that they can start breathing better on their own versus when that doesn't happen, they're more likely to need a lot of like deep suction and intervention that affects their mouth and their throat and the way that they use their mouth after birth and the way that they use their throat. And that can have, like, again, down the road, lots and lots of consequences with things like feeding and oral reflexes and speech and yada, yada, yada. And it also, the other thing that's happening when you're born vaginally is you're being exposed to different bacteria in mom's vagina, which helps to seed your gut and provides the foundation for your microbiome. It is there's several things that do that, but when babies miss that, they tend to have a very different microbiome, very different gut health than other kids that are born vaginally. And we know that affects long-term immune function and gut health. We know that there's a big connection between gut and brain health. So there's just so many things that are going on that all might seem really small when you look at just one of them, but they can add up over time.
What's striking me is, again, partially the complexity, but also this notion of I say this all the time, like some kids, they weren't fully cooked. Their nervous systems are not fully cooked. And so I guess I don't know if I even have a question, but like, who else is talking about this? Are the doctors aware that this is a thing? Like, where are we having these conversations other than here?
Honestly, I don't know. The problem is that the types of people that typically are caring for pregnant moms and babies are not the types of people that are caring for complicated kids later on. They're not the ones that are dealing with maternal mental health issues later on. There's just this real gap in awareness. And there are people that are talking about those things. We are trying to kind of bring them together. But at the end of the day, your OB is responsible for getting you safely through birth. And then your pediatrician is responsible, or you're especially in the hospital, your pediatrician is responsible for getting your baby home safely. They're not thinking about all of these kind of downstream consequences.
Mhm.
Plus, our medical system is screwed up. There's a lot of things that go into why we do the things that we do that have nothing to do with health or longevity or long-term development. So there's a lot.
Okay. So we know you've outlined this beautifully. Like, there are risks associated with all of this stuff. What do we do with this information?
Well, that depends on where you're at, I guess. If
Mhm.
you are a mom who's pregnant, for example, then my best advice to pregnant moms is to be really careful about what care provider you risk or you pick, because your number one risk factor for having a cesarean is not how healthy you are or whether or not you have diabetes. It is where you choose to deliver. That is your number one risk factor. And so there are hospitals and places that have 70% C-section rates. So it doesn't really matter how healthy you are or how safe your baby is. You're likely getting a C-section if you go to a place like that. There's others that have like a 10 to 15% C-section rate, which is where we should be at according to like the World Health Organization. We should be in closer to that range. Your care provider really is the one that's going to determine what type of care you get and how likely you are to need interventions. So finding somebody that has low intervention rates, that understands preventative care, that understands the benefit of like in-depth prenatal care and helping you with nutrition and prevention and all those things. So if you're pregnant, that's typically my advice. If you have a new baby and say you had a C-section and you're like, oh no, I've got this newborn and we had a C-section, are we just screwed? And no, you're not. There's a lot of things that we can do after. And what we want to do and think about is supporting that baby's body and nervous system and all of the things that they need to develop properly. And so I mentioned that our brain development happens based on experience, but the other thing is that it happens based on movement, and how we move and use our body directly impacts the way our brain develops. So that's why things like forceps and vacuum delivery and cesarean delivery can be difficult and hard, because it can increase your likelihood of having things like a neck injury or things going on where babies don't turn and move their heads properly. And typically those things are missed unless they're really significant. Like you see a baby's just like really quick to the side, but there can be smaller problems that we don't quite catch. And it just seems like we've got a fussy baby or a baby that's not really latching very well. But there's a lot of physical things that can go on.
I just want to pause here for a second, because what you're talking about, and the reason I like talking to you so much, is these are not different problems. And I actually think I said this at the last time we met, which is a baby who has a weak suck or has trouble latching is a baby that has a body, a nervous system, a brain that is not working properly. And
Yes.
right, that's not a feeding issue, that's a neurological developmental issue. And
Yes.
we put these things in buckets and act like that they're separate. I mean, the same with torticollis. I mean, the number of physical therapists who, and I love physical therapists, bless them all. But if we think that torticollis is just that the neck is shorter on one side than the other, we have missed the memo completely, as far as I'm concerned. Can you back
Yes,
me
I
up here?
completely, 100%, 100%. No, that's why, like, body issues are brain issues, especially for babies, because they're just, it's, there's so like all of their development that's happening is so physical and early, and all of these pieces are just so deeply connected. So you're right. It's not just a body issue, it's a nervous system issue. And all of these things are connected and play a role. So if you're in that stage, if you're a parent that has a baby that's struggling, then I really recommend finding somebody who understands this type of body work. And there are PTs out there who don't just look at it as a neck muscle thing, but who really understand how do we help infants and their whole body. So body work type stuff, PT, chiropractic that is like very specialized in whole body nervous system, craniosacral type therapies can be really good. Just really getting your baby's body settled and working well so that when they have time on the floor, they are moving their body as well and they are engaging with their environment in a big way. That's a big thing. The other big thing for moms in this stage is to really work on your own, like, attachment and mental health and your own emotional well-being, because if you are regulated and well and healthy, you will naturally take care of your babies so much better. And that's a big thing that I see too, is that we get hyper focused on our babies are not struggling, and we kind of tend to neglect our own self and struggles there. And babies are very sensitive to us, and if we're doing well, they are a lot more resilient. So that's the advice then. And then if you're later and you're down the road and you have an older complicated kid and all those things happened, and now what? There's a lot of different kind of therapies that we can do to really target these types of things, these early reflexes. So find somebody like me that understands this, that can work on things like primitive reflexes and nervous system function, and that has kind of a holistic view of that, that doesn't just look and be like, oh, you have a reflex and so we just need to do all of these one reflex issues, rather than seeing how reflexes are one part of a whole nervous system and a whole body. And their kids really can make a lot of incredible changes way down the road. It's not like we had a bad birth and now we're screwed for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And yeah, neuroplasticity is a thing, right? We know it's a thing. We know it continues throughout life. And yeah, no, it's important. I want to say one thing that because you mentioned fussy babies. And I think sometimes, this is apropos of kind of looking holistically, we think that a fussy baby has a personality problem. Fussy baby does not have a personality problem. They may have a reactive temperament. I do, temperament, I think, has been studied enough to be a thing. And possibly tied. You want to pick it up here?
Sure. Yes. No, fussy babies are, I mean, I look at fussiness, even not just in babies, but in older kids too, as like a sign that there is something else going on. I think of these things as like communication. Not that all toddler communication is appropriate. Sometimes we have to like set the boundaries on some of those things. But especially for little babies, behavior and fussiness and things like a lot of crying and being really sensitive might be a sign that there's something else going on underneath it. They're uncomfortable in some way, that they're stressed in some way, that you're stressed in some way, and you're dysregulated and you need some help and support. And they are picking up on that for you from you. There's a lot of different reasons why babies can be fussy, but babies shouldn't just be fussy all of the time. It's not to say that there can't be periods that are normal. Yeah, like that does happen, but usually it's a sign that there's something else going on and we need to kind of tune in and figure out what we can do to support these little ones.
Yeah. You're making me think of this chart, which I probably still have somewhere, where I was convinced that my baby was crying all day long. And I took data for like 3 days and I was like, oh, he's not crying all day long. He's crying for like 20 minutes before a nap. I remember seeing the data and being like, oh, right. And I will validate every parent listening who says, no, my kid really does cry all day long. Right. And so just to take the data, to be aware and to know that, right, humans are not meant to be in a state of distress as a regular, that's not a homeostatic state. That's not it. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading, man, I didn't even think about it. I should have like prepped and looked at this, but I remember reading an article about like how often Babies in different cultures cry. And there was one where they were looking at cultures where moms wear their babies a lot, and babies don't cry nearly as much when they're being worn. They also are less likely to have retained reflexes and other things when they're being worn. They get a lot of good, like sensory input and vestibular input when they're being worn. So there's just a lot of practices too in our culture that aren't necessarily there to support newborn development and healthy development. And look, I get it because I was a mom that was like living in it and trying to work and trying to deal with difficult relationship things and all of the stuff in postpartum. So this is not to say like, oh, you need just need to do more. Like we I understand that we live in a culture that does not support new moms and new babies very well, that it is an uphill battle to do all of these things. But
Yeah. Emily Roper, if people want to learn more about you and your practice, because you do work with people online or no?
yes, I do. I
Okay.
work with families online. So
So, how do we do that? How do we find you?
sure. Best place would be to probably go to my website first. It's earlyrootsTherapy.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook at Early Roots. And so if you message me on there, it'll come directly to me. So
Perfect. And we will link to all of that in the show notes. It is such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
thank you so much.